Morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Good, good. So, what I want to do today is I want to build off of our last class, which we introduced our new unit, right? Ecology and life systems, and we look at some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this unit. So, I want to start digging in to some of that today. So, what I want to focus on today are the roles of organisms. Specifically in an ecosystem. So I want to look at the different roles that different organisms take on in an ecosystem. Maybe, maybe for example, we'll look at some specific ecosystems and different animals and organisms there, but really what I want to look at are the general roles in just generally an ecosystem that we would find. And secondly, what I want to look at are how do these roles relate to each other? How do they work with each other? How do they interact with each other? How do they affect each other? So those are our two learning goals today. Identifying the different roles in an ecosystem and identifying how these roles affect and work and relate to each other. So start with me if you will. I want to start with an analogy. The analogy being our classroom in our school. So I want you to look around, think about our school, look around the classroom, and think about the different roles that we take on or that we see in our school. And I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. Look around, see what you can find. So, what are some different roles that we see in the school setting and in our classroom? Awesome. Tons of great examples. Teacher, student. Two huge examples right off the bat. We have our principals. We have our custodial staff. Here in our classroom, we have our homework monitors, our attendance runners, our lab assistants. Tons of roles that we divvy out and responsibilities that each of us take on. And the goal of that being to make sure that our classes and our school run efficiently and effectively and sustain our school and sustain our classrooms daily. We don't have to worry every day about how the attendance is getting down to the office. We have our attendance runner to that we just know will take care of that responsibility. Or we don't have to worry about who's checking off the homework every day. We have our homework monitors who we know, at the end of the day, we'll go to the board and check off the homework and make sure that everything's written down on the agenda for everyone to see, right? So we can kind of look at these roles that we have in our school and in our classroom and look at our school as sort of an ecosystem in itself, right? So moving from there, if you will, follow me to a natural ecosystem. Just like our analogy that we have, our natural ecosystem is comprised of organisms and plants and animals, and they all have different roles that they take on and responsibilities that they take on in the ecosystem. So initially I want to start off with two major roles that we find in an ecosystem. First of all, though, I want to say, what I want to do this class is I want to do a class note-taking exercise. So if I could get you all to just close your books, put your pencils down, I'm going to open up the Word document on the board here. And I just want you guys to be present for the discussion. And we're going to discuss and come up with notes and ideas as a class. And I'll keep track of our discussion on the Word document. And what I'll do is I'll save that file and I'll post it to our class Edmodo page. That way everybody has access to those notes. And it saves you from writing this period. And you can just focus on what we're talking about. Sound good? Perfect. So I want to focus beginning with the two sort of major roles that we see in ecosystems. Number one being called producers. So looking at producers, these are organisms that produce their own food, basically. So when we think of organisms that produce their own food, what do we generally think of? Think of plant life, right? We think of trees and shrubbery and organisms that use the sun's energy and through photosynthesis, which I know you're all familiar with, um, create their own nutrients and create their own food. So these are what we call producers. They produce their own food, right? Secondly, we have consumers. So looking at the word consumer, what do we think that means? It's something that consumes other organisms for its nutrients. So these consumers don't have the ability to create their own food, so they prey on other organisms, or they prey on producers to get those nutrients. So those are two important classifications: producers and consumers. And in the example I just gave you, we can break it down further, right? We have two different kinds of consumers, correct? We have, those consumers that eat producers or eat plant life, and we also have those consumers that eat other consumers. So the way that we would break that down even further is we would call one a primary consumer and another a secondary consumer. And we could take that even further, which we'll look at when we get to food chains and food webs. A consumer that eats a consumer that's already eaten another consumer. That would be a tertiary consumer. But we'll get there. We'll just focus on primary consumer, an organism that eats plant life or eats a producer, and secondary consumer, a consumer that eats another consumer. So if we could relate sort of the idea of producer and consumer to the analogy that we started with as our classroom, what might we classify in our sort of classroom space as a producer? Right. So, for example, maybe one good way of looking at producer in our initial analogy would be looking at the teacher. Right. The teacher is a producer. We sort of relay the knowledge, or we take that energy or that knowledge, and we produce it outwards to you guys. So in that case, who would be our consumers? It would be you guys, right? It would be our students, right? Our students are consuming the knowledge. So let's say right now I'm the producer, and I'm sort of teaching you guys, sharing a lesson with you guys, and you guys are absorbing that lesson. You guys would be consumers, correct? We've established that. What about somebody who's away today? What if they got notes off of someone else and not from me? Maybe we could classify that as a secondary consumer, right? They're consuming the knowledge that's already been through the primary consumer. I know it's a little hard to keep track of, but if we can sort of expand that analogy further, me being the producer and you guys being the consumers, somebody who's learning from one of you guys might be a secondary consumer, right? So let's look. We have our consumers and our producers now. I want to add another role onto that. Another role that we find in ecosystems. Which I'm going to pose the question to you. We have our producers and consumers. What happens to the waste? Our ecosystem is going to have waste, correct? Everybody poops, am I right? You're going to get a consumer that's going to eat and create waste. What happens to that waste? Somebody's got to take that responsibility, right? And the organisms that do take that responsibility, we call decomposers. So decomposers are typically um, bacteria or fungi, and they eat decaying matter. Uh, so decaying matter might be dead plants, dead animals, or animal waste, um, things of that nature. And what they do with that is they convert the nutrients from that decaying matter and introduce it back into the ecosystem. And those nutrients are then picked up by the producers, used by the producers in conjunction with the sun's energy and water, and produce food for those producers again, creating sort of a nice cycle, right? It's sort of a life cycle. Um, we have the producers, then the consumers, the decomposers taking that sort of waste product and reintroducing it back into the ecosystem. So if we could follow what we did before with producers and consumers, who would be in our school setting our decomposers? So a couple ideas that we've had. Our custodial staff could be, right? I don't come in here and see garbage piling up. The garbage goes somewhere every night. And I know it happens when you guys aren't here, but yeah, the custodial staff comes in and takes away the garbage and the recycling, right? Maybe a recycling club could be a decomposer. There's a club that takes our recycling and reintroduces it or uses it in new ways around the school, right? So maybe that's a couple examples of decomposers in our sort of initial analogy there. So what I want to do now is that we've identified the three sort of major roles of producer, consumer, decomposer. We also have inside of consumer, we have our primary and secondary consumer. So now I want to look at the importance and how these roles interact with each other, which we've touched on a little bit with the decomposer, right? How do producers, consumers, and decomposers relate? Well, we've already looked at producers initially, creating nutrients for themselves to sustain their own life, and then consumers coming along and eating those producers, in which that nutrients is passed on to the consumer, correct? And that makes way for that consumer and the nutrients housed in it to go on to another consumer, maybe a secondary consumer, who eats that organism. And then we have our waste, right? So maybe that secondary consumer creates waste, or maybe it dies and it's just sort of decomposing. Then we have our decomposers, which will come along, which will take that decaying matter and turn that back into nutrients to reintroduce into the environment, in which the cycle can be related again, right? It's a life cycle, and they relate in sort of a cyclical way, right? So what I'll bring up now is I want you to just to sort of grasp the importance of roles, of these sort of roles in our environment. I want you to take a look at this picture. Does anybody know what this picture is of? Right. It's the garbage strike, Toronto garbage strike. Garbage was piling up in the city, right? It's a perfect example of basketball courts and public facilities were just storing garbage. We couldn't get rid of it, and you start getting those complaints. It starts to smell outside. Who wants to live beside a huge pile of garbage, right? Who wants to live beside a basketball court that's filled with, rotten food and just decomposing waste, right? So what happened, right? What happens there? It's sort of an example of what if we pluck one of those roles out of an ecosystem, right? So we still have our producers and consumers. We have our producers, which might be, let's look at our grocery stores and our food companies giving us food. Those are our producers. Our consumers would be us, people who go and buy this food and eat it. But then we've taken away the decomposer. We've taken away the role that gets rid of the waste. We start seeing waste piling up in the streets, and it causes an issue. It causes unbalance. It causes unrest, right? It causes a bunch of different problems. And similarly, in an ecosystem, it would cause the same, right? Yeah, if we had producers and consumers, but we had no decomposers, we'd have a bunch of waste lying around in our ecosystem, and the decomposers wouldn't be able to reintroduce nutrients into the soil, right? Or reintroduce them into the environment in a way that it could be recycled by the producers and keep moving through our ecosystem in that cyclical way. So I want to end on that note. I'm going to save our Word file, and I'll post it on the Edmodo page, and I'm going to leave you with two homework questions that I want you to think about. We've sort of gone over it already, but I want you to think about these two homework questions. I want you to think about the roles that we identified. How do they relate to the sustainability of an ecosystem? Sorry. So how do these roles, maybe not relate together, maybe contribute? How do these roles contribute to the sustainability of an ecosystem? Sustainability is going to be a big word this year that we're going to hear coming over and over again. So I want you to focus on that word, sustainability. And secondly, I want you to think about what happens when we remove one of these roles. What might be an outcome? What might be an effect? How does it disturb the balance? And I want you to relate that to the idea of sustainability as well. So I'm going to include those two questions in our notes. Copy them down if you will, but I will include those two questions on our notes so that when you go to download them from the Edmodo page, they'll be right there for you guys. And I just want you to bring in your answers, and we're going to start off next class discussing the relationship between sustainability and the roles in our ecosystem. So you guys have a few minutes to wrap up, and maybe you can brainstorm with your partner in the remaining few minutes of class, reflecting on that question, and we'll pick it up there next time. Thanks a lot.